Hey, in our podcast today, we're going to be talking about an important topic. Why are some nations rich and other nations seem to perpetually struggle with poverty and brokenness? And the second question, equally as important, are there certain cultural beliefs and values that actually set up some nations for blessing and prosperity? And also the converse, are there certain values and beliefs that actually set other nations on a trajectory of pain and misery and suffering? We've got some answers for you. We're going to be talking about that in our podcast today.
Hey, welcome to the Ron Johnson Discipleship Podcast.
Here we are again. We are so excited to chat with you. And what you all don't get to see is the pre-podcast discussions that Pastor Andrew and I have. We have to literally say, stop, quit talking. We need to save this content for when it's live. So this was another one of those mornings when we're laughing and cheering excitedly. Isn't it amazing? When I first was introduced to Christian worldview, it just made me come alive because I realized, wait a minute, the Bible and truth is a foundation for everything, and when you see the ripple effects of biblical truth and understanding and the impact that it has in a real world, not a mystical world, but like real world, it just invigorated me. And I joke around before when I was off at Regent University, which of course was a Christian university, where they tried to immerse every subject matter in biblical worldview. I could still be in school just because it is amazing to me when a mind comes in contact with truth, with a capital T, absolute truth, and you see the impact of ideas for good and bad. It's just absolutely exciting. And so that's I guess, for me, why it's been so powerful is it awakens my heart,
Right.
Because it's not like I'm a pastor just because I couldn't think of anything else to do with my life. It's like I was apprehended by the Lord, apprehended by truth, and taken captive in a good way, captivated by truth. And I hope as you guys are watching these podcasts or listening along with us, that it awakens something in your heart, just to the excitement of knowing Jesus, the excitement of reading the Word and seeing the impact that the Bible has had in our world.
Well, I think that's the biggest eye-opening thing for me is, growing up in the church, is all these very high-level idealistic things that seems like there's not a lot of practical implication in our world, because there's a disconnect between the church and our everyday life. And once you understand biblical worldview, or really principle of God's kingdom, and Jesus came to promote a change of regime, right? Ushering a brand new kingdom. What you realize is all these high-level ethereal ideas like, love your enemies and serve each other and care for each other, have practical implications that led to prosperity of people's lives. Right. And once those dots are connected, you're like, wow, these aren't just ideas you sit around and just talk about, pontificate about. These are ideas that has practical implications in our everyday lives. That is so empowering should be so empowering for every believer.
Well, you brought up a really good point, and it's one that I like to touch on a regular basis. I think I touched on it last Sunday. The word prosperity in the church has gotten a bad rap because of our prosperity teachers and some of the name it, claim it, if you have faith, you'll be rich, those types of things, which are perversions of the gospel. But we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. This book that and for those of you who are maybe turning in for the very, very first time, we've been in a book called The Book That Made Your World. And it's an incredible read, but basically it is capturing the reason behind wherever the gospel goes, there's an economic lift. It brings prosperity, and that's biblical prosperity, and there's nothing the matter with prospering. In fact, the opposite is equally concerning, the opposite error, where the church preaches that poverty is almost a form of holiness, and we just quickly want to dismiss that is as worse of a lie as the prosperity gospel. There's nothing virtuous about poverty for poverty's sake. Prosperity means you not only have enough to take care of your family, but you have enough to care for other people and to help the poor and to help those that are less fortunate.
Right.
So prosperity is a biblical thing, and I think this book, especially this chapter, which is called True Wealth, this chapter does a great job of giving the noble purpose behind why nations prosper. And so let's just talk about that, because this is a controversial topic today. Why are some nations poor and other nations rich? The progressive answer is that basically that white people exploited everybody else, and that's why certain countries are wealthy. It's because they have exploited other classes of people and plundered, other people's resources. Or it's the old inequality of resource argument, right? Some nations naturally have more natural resources while other nations don't. But what we find is people are the same. They're made in the image and likeness of God. Planet Earth is the same. There are resources in every nation of the world.
You have some of the most impoverished nations with great natural resources.
Absolutely.
So that's not necessarily the factor, right?
So I think about Venezuela, incredible oil and gas resources, but they're impoverished now because of communism, communist dictator. So the question, again, why are some nations wealthy and some aren't? So that's what he's addressing. And he asks the question, do cultural beliefs and values condemn whole cultures to poverty? And the converse would equally be true. Do certain cultural beliefs and values actually set up other nations for incredible wealth?
Yeah.
And I think he makes a good case of talking about that. So set the stage for us. He's talking about the World's Fair 1851 in London. And he introduces us and maybe our listeners today to an historical figure who made a humongous impact and who had a display there in fact, it was part of the American display at the World's Fair that was mocked and ridiculed.
It was in London, this World's Fair, and all the European nations brought their arts and their prestigious, architecture,
Their wealth.
and then you got these two American inventors who brought something that's practical, right? It's a reaper, right? It's some type of wheat reaper or something like that.
Yes.
It's a functional farming equipment that helps it be more efficient.
In fact, the London Times, the newspapers have been doing this, I'm realizing now, for centuries, right? The London Times ridiculed this horse-driven reaper created by Cyrus McCormick. They ridiculed it as a cross between a flying machine, a wheelbarrow, and a chariot. And so the elite were mocking the Americans who were considered backwards. And here on display was this massive diamond that coming from India that was put in the Queen Victoria's crown. And you go to the American exhibit, and it was again ridiculed as the Prairie Ground exhibit. And here's this reaper that looks like some crazy flying machine. Nobody really knows what it's all about. And Americans were ridiculed because they were kind of the new world. They were the backwoods, pioneers. And yet, in a short amount of time, the West catapulted into incredible economic prosperity. And part of it was because of this guy, Cyrus McCormick, who he spends a lot of time introducing us to. This reaper was capable of harvesting 20 acres of land a day. Now, when you think about the old sickle route, right? When you're out there swinging the sickle, imagine, 20 acres is roughly the amount of ground that Living Stones is on. Imagine swinging that sickle all day long and seeing how far you'd get doing it all by hand. Backbreaking work, out in the heat, just miserable. And now all of a sudden you come along with a machine that does all that work for you and takes you from maybe, 1 acre a day, that would be a pretty good piece of land, to 20 acres a day. Not only does it remove the toil, but it increases the production and the output. And so this was an incredible invention that literally transformed the world. But he asked the question, why is it that the Americans are thinking about how to create reaping machines when there are other people in other parts of the world? He says again, the myth of necessity being the
mother of invention.
Yeah, necessity was everywhere. Feeding people is a global phenomenon. So that necessity exists everywhere. Why is it, and he again brings his own culture, why is it that the Indians, why is it that the Chinese, why is it that the Russians and other places, why is it they were not using the engineering genius of their people to create something that removes toil and actually feeds people and increases productivity? That's the question. What was the cultural environment that was necessary to lead to that kind of...
Right, he's saying necessity is not necessarily the mother of invention, because necessity is everywhere. But in many of these nations, that is not reinforced by a biblical worldview. When you have necessity, what you do is you just get more slaves. You just get more manual laborers. You just get more children to work in the field.
Right.
Whereas in the Christian worldview, they see toil as bad, and that you see us as made in image and likeness of God, and we're supposed to love and care for our neighbors. So Cyrus McCormick says, because of his worldview, he says, I'm going to create something that will reduce toil and increase productivity. And because I'm made in the likeness of God, I have the inventive idea to go and create this machine that makes our lives easier and increase productivity, increase economic for our neighbors and for everyone, so we can feed more people.
Yep.
And so it's the worldview that made the difference. It wasn't necessity, is the worldview.
That's good. You and I have both been to the East, and again, some of the most incredible works of art are produced. Chinese history, Indian history. I've spent a lot of time in India. I've been over there probably at least 10 times. And there are elaborate temples that probably took generations to make. I mean, I've been to the Taj Mahal. You can see why it's one of the wonders of the world. It's unbelievable. But again, those things were created on the backs of peasants who were basically people who did not have the power to say no. Mm-hmm. So he talks about people that were not landowners, people who were slaves, women, children. Basically, that was the force, the economic force, the workforce behind creating these amazing works of art. So we create these works of art, these temples, these palaces, but nobody was using their brain work, as you pointed out, to help alleviate the misery of the peasant class. That's because only Christianity provided a worldview that suggested you could even care about the peasant class in the first place. Right. And he brings up a good point. He says, love is not a common ethical principle of all religions. That was, again, eye-opening. He said, in other cultures, you're not thinking again about how do I love my neighbor. If someone's a peasant in India, it's because of karma. And as we talked about in the last episode, you don't try to relieve people from their misery. It's actually the gods punishing them for their previous life. And so only the Christian worldview provided the economic culture to where somebody would go, wait, let's think about a way to make these people's jobs easier so they're not out here slaving all day long and suffering.
And I think another key factor to economics, invention, creating systems and processes for the prosperity of not just yourself but your neighbors is the biblical worldview of take dominion of the earth. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge factor because most cultures see the world as, I think we talked about this in the other podcast, they see the world as chaos and gods and demons and spirits and mythical and magic. So there's no order, there's no chaos. You're a victim of your world. But when the biblical worldview says, no, we're supposed to take dominion, I think you just preached on it a couple of weeks ago, we're supposed to take dominion of the world, all of a sudden you change your mind that says, we are the rightful stewards of this world. Let's look at this chaos. Let's look at this problem. How do we solve this problem? How do we collaborate, ingenuity, get materials, science, whatever, and solve this problem? Because that is probably one of the most important dedications in the Bible to wealth and invention. Because that says that we are supposed to be stewards and not victims of this world.
That's good. And the notion, as you pointed out, that the world is not chaotic or evil, the material world is actually good. If the material world is good, you're not running from it. You're not avoiding it. You're also not worshiping it, which is what you pointed out. You can't take dominion over something that you worship. If we worship the one true God, our goal is not to dominate God. Our goal is to know Him and love Him and serve Him. It's the same thing with planet Earth. If you worship the earth, you're not going to take dominion over that river and use it to irrigate your plants, you're going to worship the river while your people starve to death. And so it was, again, these ideas that are so profound that we take for granted here in the West. But we should not take them for granted because they are literally building blocks of creating a culture which leads to economic prosperity. And so, a great point. He's also said, we talked about this last week, the hallmark of Indian spirituality was detachment. And so, in many of these cultures, the spiritual person, right, the priest, the pastor.
Right.
Well, what was Pastor Ron doing? Was he out among the people? Was he helping alleviate misery? Was he feeding the poor? Not if you're coming from a Hindu worldview or from a host of other worldviews, because the goal in those cultures was detachment. I have to, if I'm a holy man, I have to remove myself from normal peasant, lower class people because that would somehow defile me.
Right.
And yet, as we shared, Jesus came, and those were the very people that loved him because he loved them and cared for them so much. So if you view the peasants as kind of lower class, or the working class, the blue collar folks, as a lower class, not worthy of your time or attention because you're trying to be holy and separate, you're never going to think about, hey, how can I invent something that makes these people's life easier?
Right.
It just is not part of your worldview. So that's why no other culture invented the reaper except for a Western American Christian culture, because it created, again, the worldview to make that possible.
Cyrus McCormick is a Presbyterian. I think his father came from the Puritan tradition, the Protestant work ethics. He wasn't doing it for profit. He was doing it for the glory of God, which is interesting because when I read about Cyrus McCormick, you and I both thought about the McCormick Center down the street from us in Chicago.
I think it's still like what the largest office or
convention center
in the world.
Yeah, and I was like, are they related? So I Googled it real quick and realized the McCormick Center was named after Colonel Robert McCormick, which is, I think, the grandson or one of the nephews of Cyrus McCormick. So they're all related in the same McCormick clan. Right. So this guy here, the wealth that he had from his family and that he propagated wealth, now there's a physical representation of their family's prosperity in downtown Chicago today.
With their name on it.
With their name on it.
But he brings out a good point. When Cyrus McCormick's father moved to the United States, immigrated to the United States, he was very meager, poor beginnings, but he had an incredible theological background. He had the theology of the Reformers who taught that work was worship. And we've touched on this. Work is worship. Toil is evil, but work is worship. And the idea of calling, the idea that hard work was for the glory of God was spiritual. That was, I guess, the connection. You know, sometimes we separate work from what's spiritual, but these folks understood what you do with the gifts God's given you, the calling that you have, the hard work that you invest every day is worship. And work and worship were then melded together in a worldview that said, no, when I wake up in the morning and go out and work hard and I make a profit, that is what it means to be spiritual. And a lot of this, of course, came from the parables of Jesus, 2/3 of which of the teachings of Jesus are about money. And these guys were immersed in the Bible, and they understood that when the master gives you talents, he expects you to bring a profit on what he has given you. And so profit becomes a matter of stewardship, and stewardship becomes a matter of spirituality. What a connection. Again, these are crazy connections that nobody in other cultures was putting together.
So today we have a degree of that. We have workaholism. We have people who work really hard, strong work ethics, innovation, but we just don't have the glory of God part. Right?
Well, it's been removed.
Which we'll talk about that in later, how that also has a detrimental impact on culture after, if you have the work ethics part, but not the rest of it. But right now we take all that for granted, not realizing that came largely from the Protestant traditions, from the Reformation, to say the best way for you to worship is for you to work hard for God's kingdom, use your creativity. They discover that in the Bible and they change the world. That's incredible to me.
So this whole idea of Protestant work ethic, that phrase was captured by a sociologist by the name of Max Weber. And I want to read a quote from the book about what Weber had to say. He said, but at least one thing in the Protestant mindset was unquestionably new: the valuation of the fulfillment of duty in worldly affairs as the highest form which the moral activity of the individual could assume. This is which inevitably gave everyday worldly activity a religious significance, and which first created the conception of calling in this sense. The only way of living acceptably to God was not to surpass the worldly morality in monastic asceticism. In other words, this was the Catholic tradition. The spiritual people would get away and live in a monastery and separate themselves from, quote, worldly pleasures. He said, but solely through the fulfillment of the obligations imposed upon the individual by his position in the world. This was his calling. And so if you were called to business, then you worked your job to the glory of God, and you took whatever money you had, and your goal was to turn it into profit. Mm-hmm. This Protestant work ethic caused the Western countries to outshoot the European forebears. And in a short amount of time, the West became an economic powerhouse, but it became a powerhouse not because we had smarter people, not because we had more natural resources, not because we're exploiting people, but because just the opposite, because we're using our gifts and seeing work as something honorable and actually as worship. Yeah. What a radical idea. Let's talk a little bit about... I love this. Francis Bacon and this whole idea of fatalism. He said that the Bible taught that we should not just sit back and, hey, I'm poor, I guess that's just my lot in life, but that the Bible actually destroyed this fatalistic notion, whatever will be, right? Mm-hmm. I just come from a poor family, and I guess I'm just supposed to be poor the rest of my life or whatever. Let's talk about that a little bit. So talking particularly about the lessons from the children of Israel, the Hebrews, and their initial situation in Egypt, and yet how God turned all that around. So right. How does the Bible inspire one to entrepreneurship, which is risky, or to just saying, hey, my life I'm stuck in poverty right now, but I don't have to live here.
Well, I think this is very relevant to our world today. I'll share why in a second. The Bible provides a sense of optimism for the future, that God's in control and God's on our side. Now, Christians take that for granted all day long because we throw that out there. Yeah. But if you see it from the context of the history of the world, before the advent of Christianity or even the Reformation, it's a dark place. Yeah. It's a dark place. You're I said earlier, you're a victim to your environment. You don't know what's going on. Whatever warlord can come and destroy you any moment. Why have wealth? Because you can be taken up by robbers. There's no police. It's a crazy, scary place. But Christianity comes in, and the Bible teaches that God's on our side, and He calls us to take dominion, to be prosperous. He's with us. He's not against us. Those promises led to a degree of optimism, which allowed people to change the world. Now, I want to speak to the Christian today, because this is something that's passionate in my heart. In the darkness that we see in the world today, there are so many Christians. They're waiting for Jesus to come back. They're waiting for the Antichrist to come and take over everything. Yep. And there's the same pessimism. It's Christianized, but the same pessimism is taking over the world and Christian world today.
Christian pessimism is actually an oxymoron, right?
Absolutely. Christ's going to come. The rapture's going to come. I don't know I can't interpret all the revelation and all that stuff. Yeah. And I'm not saying that isn't going to come one day, but that is not the heart of a Christian to be pessimistic and to wait for the Antichrist to come and become the president, whatever. No, there should be a sense of optimism in us to make change and make a difference, because this call for us to take dominion of the world, have we abandoned that because who's in government right now? Because the IRS, the FBI, because of Big Pharma? Do we lose our optimism that just like these guys did in the past, or should we recapture the optimism? I only call optimism faith in God, that God's control, that we can take dominion of the world. That's very passionate to me right now.
Think about this, that we quote verses as we should. The Bible's full of them. With God, nothing is impossible. Yeah. Most cultures' view of God is certainly not a father, not a loving king, not a shepherd. These are all understanding of the kingdom of God and how God has revealed Himself to us. The God of Islam is not, hey, if God is for you, who can be against you? Now, He could care less. He's very harsh and domineering and stern. The gods of the Hindus, millions of gods. The spirit gods in African nations of kind of a pantheism or tribal, spirits or whatever. These are not gods that are like on our side, they're for us. You're always trying simply to appease those gods to keep them from doing bad things to you. But that's not the worldview of the Christians. God hears our cries. And what Moses taught us was that God is a God who not only loves us, but he speaks into our culture. So the laws of God are actually the wisdom of God given to us so that we can prosper. So let's just put it this way. What is a secret of success for countries that prosper economically? Well, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Righteousness exalts a nation. Well, what is righteousness? Righteousness is simply understanding the law of God and obeying it and honoring it and putting it into practice. So you don't even have to be a Christian to prosper. You can find biblical principles and put them to practice in your life.
Yeah.
And because you're practicing truth, you'll prosper even though you don't yet know the God of truth.
Yep.
And so this was radical. We started reading the Bible. We started seeing God wants to bless nations. God wants to bless individuals. God blesses obedience. God blesses covenant. And then if you put these things into practice in a very real world, you're blessed. Like, I love how he points out that other cultures were seeking magical powers through ritual and sacrifice, whereas the West began cultivating technological and scientific prowess. In other words, a lot of these worldviews were all about appeasement and ritual and sacrifice and pleasing the gods out there, whereas Christians say, no, we know the one true God. And we're going to search out his laws, and we're going to search out in the creative realm ways of taking dominion over the planet that inspired science and technology, which we talked about in previous podcasts. But to understand again that these came from a culture full of ideas that gave rise to these practices. There's a reason why we are seeking dominion through science and technology.
Right. There is a discrete law that God's given us for us to discover. And once we discover those laws, we can use those laws to take dominion of the world. Absolutely. That itself is a sophisticated thought that we have taken for granted that hasn't existed in the world before. But again, the idea is we can take dominion. We are the heirs of the promise. The meek shall inherit the earth. I mean, all of these are very optimistic ideas that's introduced by Christianity that was in the world before. And I feel like in many ways, we modern Christians have lost sight of all those things. And what it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You keep waiting for the Antichrist to come, you keep retreating, and guess what? The darkness keep coming.
So pessimism,
yes,
victimhood, fatalism, it's always going to be this way. I can't change. Who am I? I'm just one voice. I mean, all of these things are really demonic because they paralyze people and they keep us from fulfilling our God-given potential.
Right, and we become the heathens who just sit there and become victimized, whereas we have the worldview that says, no, we can go take dominion. We can go change the world. We can go reform and get rid of corruption in our own government. We can do it, but we got to do it. We got to have the emotional framework, the theological and emotional framework to get up every day and says there are challenges ahead, but we got to face it. Where do we get that from? From our faith, from the scriptures.
Yeah. The Bible's full of stories and accounts of the underdog, so to speak.
But that's what these guys did to change the world. And did we lose sight of that today? That's the question I'm asking Christians today.
So he quotes Adam Smith in this book, Wealth of Nations. Hey, this is like size 10 font, all right? And this is quite a tome, all right?
Yeah.
We're probably not going to be working our way through this in future podcasts, but I do recommend that this is the economic theorist that our founders cut their teeth on, and that modern capitalism is based upon. It's right there. But I want to quote again from our author. He says, Adam Smith had observed, as do some of today's ecological economists, that the universe has been so structured by its creator that in seeking their self-interest, creatures help to maintain the grand economic balance. We may strive to make money in our self-interest, but if we do so within the boundaries of moral limits, then the Creator's invisible hand turns our labor into a matter of public good. Now, this was a radical concept. In other words, self-interest within the bounds of moral integrity, right, is not a bad thing. In other words, why do you get up hard and go to work? Well, because you're getting paid for your job. And if you work hard, you make a good living. If you make a good living, you can provide for your family. If you create, if you generate wealth, you can do more things. You can have a nicer house. You can drive a car maybe instead of walking. I mean, this is all rooted in healthy self-interest. Self-interest in and of itself is not evil. It becomes evil when we move from healthy ambition into greed. And greed is simply operating outside of the moral boundaries God has established. In other words, we're not doing it for the glory of God, for the good of people. We're doing it primarily making myself an idol, making myself king. But ambition is not bad, and that's what Adam Smith highlighted, was that, why do we get up and go to work? Why do we create things? Because it blesses us, because we're serving our families and we're providing for our families. And I think this is an important thing to understand. The failure of communist countries is they violate the command of God by stealing they don't recognize private property, and then secondly, they steal the private property of their citizens. And so let's just take a look at our neighboring state, Illinois. If you're a business owner and you're being taxed at an ungodly rate, in other words, they think because you're successful, you're supposed to support everybody that doesn't want to work in the state of Illinois. And so they're taking from you, literally robbing from you through redistribution of taxation and of your money that you worked hard for. So if you're in a state that's going to take 60% of your money that you make, and there's a state right next door that's going to take 20%, where are you going to go set up your business? This isn't rocket science. You're going to leave states that are taxing you to death, and you're going to go to states that are not going to tax you to death and steal all of your money. Because this is called enlightened self-interest. Like, I'm a fool. Why would I want to work hard for the state? I have no desire to work hard for the state. Why would I want to invent for the state if the state is going to steal my intellectual property? And so the rule of law, that kings are not able to steal from us, the rule of law that says there's no chaos allowed in the marketplace in terms of robbing and stealing ideas or whatever. So we have copyrights and we have things like this. Where did all this come from? This came from an understanding that God is a lawgiver, that the law is to protect the rights of the individual, not the collective masses, and that when those laws exist, and I know that my idea will not be stolen because of copyright laws and so forth, it incentivizes creativity. It incentivizes businesses to start and to take the risk involved in creating a new business. This is how you generate wealth, not by stealing from people through taxes and not by stealing people's ideas through corrupt laws.
The biblical worldview says the king is not above God. Right. God's above everything. So his law, everyone submits under the law. The king submits under the law too, because the law belongs to God. So imagine if that's not the case, and you're a business owner, you go into this nation to create a business, and at any point the king can come and just take your money. Would you even try? Will you take the risk, the hard work? Will you innovate and create a business in that nation? You would never do that because there's no stability, and you work hard, and all of a sudden anybody can come and just take everything. Yep. So in that nation, there's no infrastructure, because what business owners or business innovative entrepreneur comes is they look at the chaos and they solve problems and they create order out of this chaos, and they work hard to do it and they compensate well for it. That's really the heart of a biblical entrepreneur. They create, like God, reflection of God's image. They look at chaos and create order. Now, if there's no infrastructure, moral infrastructure, the government come and just take whatever you want, no one's going in there to do that. So the framework for God, for a moral God, for a law that transcends the government is so important for the prosperity of any economy because of the entrepreneur. That is the secret to keeping a nation wealthy.
And the infusion of capital. No one is going to invest capital in a country where that capital can be confiscated. So if you're a Western investor and you're seeing amazing opportunity in an Eastern country, let's just say, but it's not a Christian worldview, maybe it's communism, or maybe it's just chaos, or maybe it's led by a totalitarian tyrant. you're not going to take your hard-earned capital and invest it in that business. As you said, when tomorrow the government can say, we're going to take this coffee shop. It's now property of the government.
Right.
Or we're going to steal this land. We need it for something else, so you're out of business. And it's the same way. We're dealing with this, by the way. We've seen kind of this crony capitalism. We saw it under the Obama administration when he was bailing out certain businesses, but not other businesses. Too big to fail, kind of the argument. We saw this during COVID when the government was coming in and saying, you're not essential, you are essential, you can stay open, you can't stay open, and literally watching so many smaller businesses be driven out of business by government. This is the kind of government behavior that destroys and puts a throttle on economic growth.
Well, let's be clear. You can go to these communist countries and you hand the money to the right people, and you yourself can make a lot of money through these, these means.
Greasing the palm.
But it will not provide wealth for the nation, and that's the key. This is not just about you getting wealthy. It will not provide prosperity for the nation as a whole because of there's no even playing ground. It's through these corrupt hands. So again, we're talking about the prosperity for not just yourself, but for the whole nation, as the Bible has commanded us. You need a moral infrastructure. That's my point.
Yep. And McCormick, because the West had that moral infrastructure, this was in the 1850s. He amassed a family fortune of over $10 million, which, as you said, is probably like closer to $1 billion today. But he did some really innovative things. I love this. He was the first to introduce field trials. So instead of just buy my reaper, trust me, it works, he'd say, no, take the reaper out. And let's do some field trials. Let's compare the reaper's work with your guys over there with the sickles, and let's see the difference. And he actually came up with the fact that for every $1 that you spend on this machine, you're going to save $100. Now that's an amazing sales technique.
Right.
So he did some pretty crazy things. He invoked a guarantee. If you buy this, I guarantee this will happen. If it doesn't happen, your money back.
Right.
Well, wow, that was a radical idea. Testimonials.
Right.
Where I go
Google reviews.
Hey, Pastor Andrew, you bought my reaper last year. How's it working for you?
Right.
So the whole satisfied customer.
Yeah.
In other words, honesty in marketing, not shady marketing, not selling something that's a lie. And cash and deferred payments. So he'd say, look, okay, so you can't afford my reaper, but I'm so convinced that this reaper is going to generate profit that I'll let you use my reaper for a year before you have to pay anything. So the whole idea of deferred payments. Now, all of this is rooted in trust, fair play.
Contract.
Rule of law, and a healthy confidence that what I'm sharing with you is true.
Right.
I'm not selling you, these Ginsu knives. Buy now, and they're really plastic and they don't work. No, this is like real life. Take this out, touch it, work with it, use it.
Yeah.
So this was radical stuff. And you brought out a good point. Back in the day, if something said made in Japan, you laughed because you knew it was garbage. But the Japanese started saying, wait a minute, we've isolated ourselves, we're not letting anybody in, we're falling behind in technology, we need to learn from other nations. In other words, they employed a healthy humility.
Right.
And now Japan creates some of the finest products. Before, if you had a car made in Japan, it was a piece of junk. Now the Japanese automobiles are some of the best engineered in the world.
Yeah.
And all this happened because they began to learn from the West.
So it's interesting because this author, I appreciate it because he covers all kind of perspective. He's like, well, if biblical worldview, Western civilization caused prosperity in the nation, let's talk about some of these Eastern nations that's prosperous. So he mentioned Japan, he mentioned India, he mentioned China, and basically his argument is that these Eastern nations saw the West and they start imitating the West, and Japan was the first one who says, you know what, we cannot be isolationists. We got to learn, we got to grow, and they become very prosperous, And I will add South Korea into that mix. Of course, South Korea is highly Christian, has a lot of biblical worldview understanding that calls there, compared to the North, for example.
Oh, yeah.
But, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, he brought out a point that the Japanese learned from the Dutch.
Yeah.
And why were the Dutch so prosperous? Because they understood that if their calling was to make watches, then they were going to make watches to the glory of God. And excellence was non-negotiable. If you're doing what you're doing for the glory of God, you're not going to offer God subpar product. You're not going to have shoddy workmanship. You're not going to use bad materials because you're doing what you're doing to glorify God. In other words, if my job is to make this watch for the Lord, as if God had arms or needed to keep time, right? But if I'm going to make this to present it to the Lord first, I'm not going to present him with garbage. So this caused craftsmanship and excellence and great material, right? You're not using shoddy materials, and you're not cutting corners. Where did all this come from? Because first of all, you did what you did to honor the Lord and then to bless people. The Japanese did not have that as part of their worldview,
right,
but the Dutch did.
They took it from the Dutch. So they copied, they influenced them. Now, what's very interesting to me, you remember back in the 90s, like we thought Japan was going to take over the world, but something happened in which something stopped this economic powerhouse. And what he was saying, which I thought is the fruit of capitalism without a biblical framework has its limits. Because what happened, what he kind of described is people were so influenced by work. They work hard. Right. But there was no Sabbath. There was no rest.
No emphasis on marriage or
no
family.
No emphasis on marriage and family. So what happened is these wives are left alone, so they don't want to have kids anymore. And the population decline hampers them like crazy. So these Japanese started investing in robots. But he mentioned the one problem robots can't do is robots cannot provide Social Security for the elderly. But something else he mentioned that's very relevant to us is rampant corruptions in their highest level of government. And that corruption, man, is something will kill your economic engine, is corruption in U.S. But because of lack of the framework, the biblical framework infrastructure, corruption creeps in and it hampers everybody.
So some of these countries in Europe, Japan's one of them, not in Europe, but many of these countries are not even replacing themselves by having children, and so they're literally going extinct and becoming bankrupt. As you said, if the next generation isn't there to pay into welfare, then the previous generation is not going to have any resources. And this is happening all over the world, especially where we've lost the value of the family, and that the notion that children are gifts from God, not economic burdens. So anyway, great stuff. We hope you're enjoying this as much as we are. This is one of the highlights of my week, is just to sit here and celebrate this amazing worldview. And I've shared this on podcasts before, but if someone can show me a worldview that actually produces the blessing and prosperity and beauty and truth and goodness, besides the Christian worldview, please let me know. But it is the champion. It always will be the champion. And wherever we understand it and live it and practice it, those are people who are blessed. So I hope you enjoy this. Share this with somebody that you know of that can use a burst of truth, especially, I love this topic, true wealth. These are things, again, that are more relevant than ever. We're talking about these in our culture, economic discussions in Congress, so forth, debt limits and all this debt ceilings, and oh my gosh. So all this is incredibly relevant, and we hope it's helpful to you. Hey, so we'll look forward to getting together with you next Thursday. Until then, have a great week.